Hey, it's Renee from the Craft Table. We have made it to week 8 of our summer embroidery stitch along. That means we are doing the stem stitch today. I hope everyone really enjoyed doing the raised chain stitch last week. It's interesting that last week when we did the raised chain stitch, we stitched that on a lot of our stems of our flowers. At least that's where I chose to do my stitching for the raised chain stitch. I love doing them on the thick stems of the flowers. So it's interesting that we're going to be doing the stem stitch this week and not stitching on stems, or at least that's not where I'm going to be demonstrating how to do the stem stitch. And I talk about that in the video. The videos are not long because it doesn't take long to demonstrate the stem stitch. And I did not stitch it in too many places on my first panel. The stem stitch is an embroidery stitch that I personally do not use a lot, and I'm not even really sure why. It's a great stitch for outlining and for stems usually. The panel that I'm stitching on, the stems are rather wide, and so I just don't think the stem stitch is a great stitch for the stems that are on our panel. But in general, the stem stitch is a good stitch to do for stems and leaves and lines, anywhere that you would typically do a back stitch or a chain stitch. You can use the stem stitch. So as I mentioned, I demonstrate the stem stitch on the panel that I'm working on now, and then I show you where I embroidered the stem stitch on my original panel in case you want to replicate that stitching. You'll see where I did it there. As I mention every week, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments here on the YouTube video. You can email me or post on the community site, any of those places. Next week, we will be learning how to embroider the fly stitch. So thank you again for stitching along. It's nice to have company while I am embroidering this panel again. So let's get stitching the stem stitch. The stem stitch is a great stitch for outlining and for stems, which could be why they call it the stem stitch. On my panel, I did not use the stem stitch on my stems. And the reason why is because these stems on the panel are quite wide, and I prefer doing the raised chain stitch on those. And that's what we did last week. But I'm going to demonstrate how to do the stem stitch on this white line that is in the center or in the middle of these green leaves. And I'm going to be using the pearl cotton size 5, and it's called Snow, and the number is, let's see if I can find it, Easy 06, in case you wanted to stitch where I'm stitching. I will point out that where I'm stitching now is not where I stitched the stem stitch on my original panel. And after I've demonstrated how to do the stem stitch, I'll show you where I did stitch it on my original panel. Okay, I'm going to do this bottom leaf first, and I've got my thread knotted, and I'm going to bring up my needle at the beginning of where I'm going to be stitching. Now the first stitch is going to be a little bit longer, just a tad longer than all the other stitches. And I'm going to start to pull my needle to the back, but I'm not going to pull it all the way through right away. So before I've pulled it all the way to the back, I'm going to bring my needle back up halfway between where my thread is coming up and then where it's going down. And then I'm going to pull my needle all the way through. All right, for the next stitch, and all the other stitches until you get to the very end. You're going to take another straight stitch, and this time you would do it typical stitch length, what you typically do. And you're going to start to pull it through, and before you've pulled it all the way to the back, you're going to bring your needle back up right where that previous stitch ended. So right there. And then pull it all the way through. And you want to keep your thread consistent. So I have my thread below the stitch line. So again, I'm taking my needle to the back, the stitch length away. And then I'm bringing my needle back up where I ended that previous stitch. And again, my needle is up here, my thread is back here. And you just want to be consistent. You can do it the opposite way. You could have your thread that way and your needle here. But whichever way you start off, you want to just keep doing it that way. So you can see this stitch can be used on lines. They could be used anywhere where you would typically use, sorry, I have a knot. You can use it anywhere you would typically use your straight stitch, your back stitch, even your chain stitch. It gives it a more fluid, continuous look than your back stitch. If you can kind of see down here, this was done in a back stitch. When you're getting towards the end, you kind of want to keep an eye on how much room you have, because the very last stitch that you do will just be a super short stitch. This would be the very last, what I would call regular stitch, where I am bringing my needle back up where the previous stitch went down. The very last stitch you make will just be a straight stitch to the back. So if this last straight stitch that you do is relatively short, it just makes the whole stitching look a little bit more even. And you can see why I didn't really use it for these stems, just because even with the 5-weight thread and my stitches being a little bit longer, I think, than I would typically do them, it would not cover that whole area. So I'm going to demonstrate the stem stitch one more time. I'm going to stitch from here to here. So my first stitch is going to be a little bit longer than I would normally take, just by a little bit. And I'm not going to pull my thread all the way through, and I'm going to keep it on this side of the line. And then I'm going to bring my needle up on that line, centering it between where I came up and where the thread is going down right here. And I'm going to pull all the way this time. So my next stitch that I'm going to take, again, I'm just going to be stitching on this white line, is going to be my typical stitch length that I like to do, which is about 1/4 of an inch. And I'm not pulling my thread all the way through, and I'm keeping my thread on this side of the line. And then I'm going to bring my needle up right where that previous stitch ended. And then I will pull my needle all the way through. And I'll keep doing that until I get to the very end, being consistent with where I have my thread. With all stitches that we've been doing, consistency in stitch length is important. It's something to work towards and takes a little bit of practice. Sometimes I find that I rush my stitching and I'm not always careful about paying attention to how far apart my stitches are. But whether it's the back stitch or the chain stitch or the stem stitch, your stitching looks nicer if your stitches are consistent in length. So I think this is my last regular stitch on this line. So I'm going to end my stitch by just taking a straight stitch to the back. And I'm done. So that is the stem stitch. So my panel took another trip in the suitcase, so it's a little wrinkly. All right, so this is the original panel that I pull out and show you where I stitched things. Only stitched the stem stitch originally in two places, and that is on this purple flower here around the outside, and then on the outline of these yellow leaves. I did the stem stitch in those two places. So as I was mentioning when I was demonstrating how to do the stitch, there are so many places that you can stitch the stem stitch. Practically anywhere there is a line or an outline. So places where you have stitched the back stitch, for instance, if you would rather, you can do a stem stitch in those places. This is the current panel that I'm working on. So I see myself replicating what I did here. And I might find myself doing more of the stem stitch, say for instance, on these white lines inside that flower, maybe even inside the white lines inside these leaves. Maybe on the outside of that leaf that the bird has in its beak. So that's what I'm thinking about. I hope that you find some places that you like stitching the stem stitch. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me or leave them in the comment section here on this YouTube video. So happy stitching, and I will see you next week.